The morning after Barry had joined the other engines, Diesel was shunting in the yard. He had just shunted some coaches into a siding when Alice backed alongside to collect her branch line flyer. "You look worried, Alice," Diesel observed, as the Atlantic engine was coupled up to her train.
"I was thinking about Barry. Did you notice last night how he reacted to Gordon's comment about being in the scrapyard?"
"Yes, he changed the topic of conversation rather quickly. It's obviously something that's troubling him."
"You're right there, Diesel,"
said Alice, recalling her conversation with Barry at the works a couple of months ago. "I suspect that last night may have been the tip of the iceberg. I saw Barry the day he arrived, you know, coming down on James's train. There was a bit of an incident just outside Henry's tunnel."
"What sort of incident?"
"I was with some workmen who were doing some welding on the track. I overheard Barry shout out to James as they went past. It seems he mistook the spark of the welder for that of a scrapper's torch. He sounded quite scared. James managed to calm him down, but still—"
"It's not healthy to let things like that linger."
"Indeed."
"I wish there was something we could do,"
Alice replied, and with that she chuffed off. A few hours later, Barry was arranging some trucks at the big harbour. He was busy and enjoying it immensely. A familiar whistle sounded out, and he looked over to see James back down on the other track. "Hello, how's your injector?" he called cordially. "Brand new," James replied. "Are those my trucks?" "Some of them, yes. I was filling in for you, but I'm happy to stay here shunting." James grinned. Although he didn't like taking trucks, it was shunting that he really disliked. "Thank you," he replied. James still needed to pick up a few trucks for his train. As he backed down towards them, the trucks began giggling. They'd overheard his conversation with Barry and decided to have a little fun. "A new injector's one thing, but the rest of you is still rusty red scrap iron," they teased as James pulled them forwards. Some of the other trucks joined in. "Rusty red scrap iron, rusty red scrap iron," they chanted.
"How dare you!"
Barry yelled, and he bumped the trucks hard.
"Scrapping is nothing to joke about. Do you have any idea what that means for trucks and engines?"
James whistled. "Barry!"
"What?"
"Barry, you've just shunted some trucks into the ocean." Barry stared at James for a moment, then back at the water.
I don't know what came over me. I just heard them teasing and saw red."
"We'd better send for the breakdown train," James said.
Yes, of course,"
Barry replied. He quickly chuffed off to get help, still slightly shocked by what he'd done. A quarter of an hour later, James had departed, and Diesel arrived with the breakdown train. As he shunted the breakdown train into position, Diesel cast his eyes over the scene before him. "Is this all your work, Barry?" he asked.
"Yes. I heard them teasing James, calling him scrap, and—"
"You snapped?"
"Yes,"
Barry replied. "I think I know what it might have been. It reminded you of being in the scrapyard, didn't it? That feeling of helplessness. I know that feeling too." Barry glared at Diesel.
"What would you know? It was engines like you who sent me and my friends to the scrapyard in the first place."
"My brothers are being withdrawn too, Barry. One morning, 4 years ago, I saw one of them being cut up for scrap. I was scared and fled here."
"That's it? I was in the scrapyard for 20 years, you silly engine. Sitting there, helpless, as other engines were cut up around me, and you, Diesel, sit there and tell me you know what I've been through. When you're a desperate, rusted hull needing significant restoration, then you can tell me you know what I've been through."
feeling better?" Diesel asked, once Barry had finished his rant. Barry didn't answer for a moment.
"Actually, yes,"
he said. He glanced apologetically at Diesel, but it was the other engine who spoke. "Don't apologize. You needed to get that out. Now, let's get these trucks back on the rails." With that, the two engines set to work. A short while later at Knapford, Sir Topham Hatt, Mike Weston, and the Fat Controller were discussing Barry.
"It is a bit of a worry," the Fat Controller was saying. "He's caused significant delay, not to mention damage to the goods that ended up in the ocean."
"I honestly had no idea he was this volatile," Weston said apologetically. "James told me he was horrified when he realized what he'd done. He was in the scrapyard for 20 years. There's bound to be some unresolved issues there." The other two men nodded in agreement. "I take your point, Sir Topham, but we can't leave them unresolved." Sir Topham nodded and recalled a conversation he'd overheard a couple of months ago. "I think I know how to sort this out, Mike. Leave it with me." Weston nodded. After all, Sir Topham had managed the engines of the North West Railway for 30 years. What he didn't know about looking after engines wasn't worth knowing. "I'd appreciate that, Sir Topham." Sir Topham smiled and glanced over at the Fat Controller. "Stephen, I may need you to make some arrangements."
"Just let me know what you need, Dad."
"I believe Alice is due to leave with the branch line flyer in about half an hour."
"That's right,"
the Fat Controller replied. "If Barry were to double-head it with her, it would give the two of them a chance to have a good talk. I know she wants to help him."
"Okay, Dad, I'll arrange it," said the Fat Controller.
A few moments later, Sir Topham left for the sheds. He'd need to talk to Alice before she took her train. Half an hour later, Alice backed down onto the branch line flyer. Sir Topham had filled her in on the harbour incident, and she was glad she'd be able to help. The last of the passengers climbed aboard, and the guard blew his whistle.
"I hear you had an accident down at the harbour this morning,"
Alice said, as the train got underway.
"You've heard about that, then?"
"Sir Topham told me about it. He's worried about you, as are your volunteers." "We don't usually have trucks tended to submarines. I gather they must have struck a nerve with their teasing?"
"That's a good way of putting it,"
Barry replied.
"It's the uncertainty that gets to you, isn't it? Not knowing what will happen next, whether you'll be cut into pieces or sent to be restored."
"At first, yes. But then as other engines were marked for rescue, I started wondering why I hadn't been picked. That's what really got to me, Alice. The more time passed, the more it seemed that the preservationists and volunteers looking for engines thought I was only useful as scrap iron. I'm ashamed to admit, I nearly lost hope."
"It must have been horrible,"
Alice said sympathetically.
"You can say that again. When the scrappers ran out of coaches and trucks to cut up, they turned their attention to us engines. I don't blame them. They were only doing their jobs. But although 213 engines were rescued from that scrapyard, 84 left in pieces."
Alice didn't reply for a moment, then a thought struck her.
"Is that why you chose the name Barry?"
"Yes, to remind myself not to forget those who didn't make it out."
"I understand,"
Alice replied. For the rest of the trip, the two engines talked, sharing their experiences and remembering engines who hadn't been as lucky as them. By the time they reached Barrow, Barry was a bit more relaxed than he had been before.
"I hope this helped,"
said Alice as they pulled into the station.
"It did, a bit,"
Barry replied. He sighed.
"If I may ask, how long did it take you?"
"A while, Barry, but I found that talking about it does help. You've got your volunteers, and I'm sure the other engines on your heritage railway will understand too."
"You've got a point, Alice. I must admit, I'm starting to feel a little foolish for not talking about this sooner."
Well, you've started talking about it now, and that's the important bit.
I see what you mean. Thank you, Alice.
You're welcome, Barry.
Over the next week or so, Barry helped out the engines of the North West Railway. A few of the other engines observed he was a bit more at ease, and he even shared a humorous anecdote with Thomas and Daisy. The trucks didn't give him any trouble, either. He was still a bit anxious whenever the subject of scrapping came up, but the other engines knew he'd need time to get over it. Before long, it was time for Barry to leave for his heritage railway.
Before I leave, I would like to say thank you for all the kindness and support you have given me. I have enjoyed my time here, and I hope to come back someday.
We'll be glad to have you back, Barry,
James said, and a chorus of whistles and horns punctuated his statement. Once they had died down, the Fat Controller stepped forward.
Thank you for helping with the summer rush, Barry. You've been a really useful engine, and I'm sure your heritage railway will be proud to have you.
Barry smiled.
Thank you, sir,
he said. After being turned on the turntable, Barry gave one last farewell toot, then chuffed off towards his new home.